Hey Sheekey, did you read any books this year? Well, of course. Let me tell you about them. Firstly, I read What Scientists Are Up To by Magnus Pyke, or more correctly, What Scientists Were Up To in 1966. It was a fun little book where I learned why distilled alcohol is called a spirit, how banana skins can be used as an analogy for biological enzymes. The banana skin can cause many people to fall over and hence is not consumed and catalyses the falling of the person to the ground. And I learnt of Louis Pasteur, most famous for milk sterilisation, and his insights of asymmetry in biology. Then I jumped into a big mystery novel, The Woman in White, by Wilkie Collins. I just really enjoyed this book. It was a book that inspired Agatha Christie to write her murder mysteries, and I reckon it's to do with the character of Marian Halcombe. Great book. Keeping with fiction, I then read Tower, written by Korean author Bae Myung-hun. This book is a collection of short stories that all set in, you guessed it, a tower. I liked it. I don't think I understood it, but I will need to reread it to make the links between the stories. Then I read The Illusion of Knowledge by Howard Katcher. I discussed this book briefly on my channel as I used it to get a feeling for the research that Katcher was conducting. My one-sentence summary was this: an interesting backstory to a recent scientific preprint on rat rejuvenation. Then I read Mushroom by Nick Money. Loved it and massively increased my love for all things fungi. On breezy days, the wind is full of invisible biology, fungal spores. As a source of airborne particulates, the mushroom is a masterpiece of natural engineering. Does any living thing seem more supernatural to a child than a mushroom? And almost every cell in a mushroom is a stem cell. So this book ranges from mushroom biology, their role within the ecosystem and symbiotic relationships, to psychedelics to health claims, a true tour de force. I also spoke with Nick about his work. After that, I read The Living Body, the first chapter of the first biological textbook written by H.G. Wells. That's right, the famous sci-fi author was a scientist. In general, it was just shocking to me how much was known at the time. Being a modern-day biologist, you might assume I'd know everything in this book, but indeed, many facts were still to be learnt. And naturally, him being a fiction author, there was also some brilliant prose. And what I've come to realise is that with less quantitative tools and less distraction, these earlier researchers were far more detailed in their observations and also way more patient to describe them. A case in point to his writing, I like this phrase: an organ such as the brain or liver is like the city during working hours. A tissue culture is like Regent's Park on a bank holiday, a spectacle of rather futile freedom. He also had some hot takes on aging. As a matter of fact, living matter is potentially immortal. Death is a consequence of incomplete organisation. The tissues die because they are part of an imperfectly balanced body. So it seems from this description that H.G. Wells was therefore bullish on the intervening in aging, and perhaps this is reflected in his science fiction writing. However, the only fiction of his that I've actually read was directly after reading this, which was The Time Machine. Short and thought-provoking. I liked it. After that, I actually went back in time and read How Life Began, a speculative study in modern biology by David Forsyth. I've mentioned this book on the channel before, and I read it because it listed a number of questions that he said he would address, and it all seemed quite interesting to me. However, he makes a number of interesting points that I actually somewhat disagreed with, mainly because we now actually have the answer, whereas here he was just being very speculative, which, to be fair, was given to me in the book title. But nonetheless, I like it when people are speculative, it's fun, and he wrote compelling arguments. But besides getting quite speculative, Forsyth also got a little bit philosophical, and I realised how little I knew of philosophy, so I read Philosophy of Biology, a very short introduction by Samir Okasha. And I've come to realise that I spend a lot of time thinking about proximate questions, such as how does this happen, me naturally being a biochemist, when I should also be considering the ultimate questions, which is, but why does this happen? Why does a cell enter cellular senescence? Anyway, after that, while I was reading this, I was travelling at the time, and these very short introduction books are super thin, so I also read The Immune System by Paul Klenneman. I've not completed my note-taking from this book, but I think I enjoyed it, and like with most books, it has made me want to research 100 more topics. From the notes I have made, it seems I got quite excited about how the body thermostat in the brain is controlled. Either way, by this part of the year, I knew I was going to be going to Japan for the summer, and wanted some encouragement to keep learning Japanese, So I read The Power of Language by Fiorika Marianne, who was interested in psycholinguistics, a field focused on the relationship between mind and language. I love the concept that a single word can convey a complex concept. An extension of this is how our vocabulary limits how we describe and see things. Now, as someone who is a scientist wanting to use sentences to describe what I observe, I therefore think understanding language is really important for how we advance in science. Enough said, it's a cool book. Anyway, speaking of languages, I was able to deploy some of my Japanese while in Japan, of course. But before and just after coming back from the country, I read this short book, Convenience Store Woman, by Sayaka Murata, a Japanese author. It centers around a 36-year-old called Keiko, who, guessed it, works in a convenience store, but seems to be content there and has no desire and no ambitions. It's funny yet tragic, and she is doing what she wants and defying society expectations. However, this makes her an outsider, and she misses out on experiences as people treat her differently. I then read another fiction book, When the Wind Blows by Raymond Briggs. It's a tragic comic book about an elderly English couple who try and prepare for an atomic bomb. They are naive and knew of Hiroshima, but ultimately, we are all helpless in these situations. I was then full thesis writing mode, so I read Have You Eaten, Grandma? By Giles Brandreth, a very funny, very British grammar book. End of. Then, because I was still missing Japan, I read Abroad in Japan by Chris Broad. It's funny and relatable and brought back many memories of my summer there. I learnt of the concept wabi-sabi, embracing imperfections, which felt very fitting while writing my thesis. Then, post-thesis submission, I read another very short introduction book, this time on Blood by Chris Cooper. I've made a few videos discussing themes from this book, and it ranges from describing what blood is to red blood cells and the immune system. A good book. After that, I read A Feeling for the Organism, a biography on the researcher Barbara McClintock, written by Evelyn Fox Keller. She was most famous for her work on maze genetics and transposable elements, and I can see many elements of myself in Barbara. In fact, we were actually both born to the same first name, but her parents decided that Barbara was probably more suitable. Anyhow, I will leave you with a phrase from McClintock, which is, well, when I look at a cell, I get down on that cell and look around. And that really is the secret to her success. She was really focused and paid attention to detail. Then I read Tokyo Express by Seicho Matsumoto, a fiction book which I have just realised is also a plot which heavily depends on attention to detail, just this time, the timing of trains. I found the book compelling, and I realised as well that this is a book that would only work in Japan, and I will say no more than that. Then, most recently, I read The Languages of Science that came out in 1963, a collection of essays by scientists with different backgrounds, though each discussing communication. It ranges from psychology to physics and engineering. Wow, Sheekey, it looks like you've been busy this year. I have. I've read a range of books. Let me know what books you've enjoyed this year below.